For a long time, I've thought that planning was the root of all evil when it came to cities. I thought Robert Moses, nasty planner, destroying the lovely neighborhoods of New York, Jane Jacobs, fighting against the evil forces of planning. I thought about the beautiful 19th century cities, completely unplanned, of course, and the organic medieval grids as opposed to the nasty gridirons of American cities. I thought that we used to build a lot. Our cities used to get bigger much quicker. Our cities used to be beautiful, and now they fail in all sorts of ways. And you know what? I was wrong. It turns out that the cities of the 19th century were much more planned than I realized, and I had to totally give up on my lifelong opinion about the evilness of planning. And the person who forced me to believe this is Samuel Hughes, a co-editor of mine at Works in Progress. I'm here with him, Aria Schrecker, and I'm Ben Southwood, an editor at Works in Progress, to discuss what made the cities of the 19th century so successful. But before we get on to the municipal socialism of the 19th century and how wonderful it was, I want to ask Samuel about one way in which I gather the cities of the 19th century were very laissez-faire. Am I right, Samuel?
So there is one core truth in the standard laissez-faire account of 19th century cities, which is that landowners did have very extensive rights to build on their own land. You don't really have anything like planning permission or zoning. Starts to come in a little bit right at the end of the century. But basically, you can build up to quite a high density wherever you are. So there are some restrictions on plot use. You sometimes have courtyards in larger blocks. And then in Europe, they tend to have some height restrictions. It's about 5 stories in Berlin, 7 or 8 stories in Paris, eventually about 10 stories in London, 6 stories in Rome. But that's about it. Beyond up to those volumes, landowners are just allowed to fill things.
And in Melbourne and Sydney and New York and Chicago and Toronto and Los Angeles and San Francisco, you can build whatever you want.
In the Anglophone diaspora countries, there are normally no height restrictions. Washington, D.C. has height restrictions related to its status as the national capital and the desire to have a very strong civic feeling in it. Boston had it's a very curious thing. It had an informal height restriction where there was a gentleman's agreement among landowners that nobody would build higher than the statue on the top of City Hall or something which was pretty high. I mean, still higher than any European city. But and otherwise, pretty much all these cities have no height restrictions, which is why after they developed steel frames and elevators in the 1880s, they get the spectacular skyscraper downtowns starting to emerge, which Europeans at the time regard as quite thrilling and fascinating, but also wild, crazy, a bit alarming.
But if they're controlling the height of the building that you are able to build, then surely that's quite a lot of restriction.
Well, it depends on the height. So there's one city where 19th century restrictions like that really were quite tight. That's Bremen in Germany, where they banned apartment buildings. I think because they saw them as Bremen's an old Hanseatic city, and they saw it as sinister, big city French, Southern European or something. So they wanted it to remain a city of merchant houses. In general, the height limits were set pretty high.
I would guess height limits are basically capped before the existence of the lift as well.
Yeah, I guess that's true. So the number of stories that you economically could build up to was probably rarely exceeds sort of 7 or so before lifts come in play. There are examples of going up to 10. I mean, physically it's possible to build higher. It's just economically it doesn't usually work. People don't want to walk up all those stairs. And also, if you're building with load-bearing masonry, the lower part of the wall has to get extremely thick in order for the wall to be stable if the wall gets very high. So your upper stories result in for every upper story you add, you have to cannibalize a bit of space on all of the lower stories when you add wall thickness. So at a certain point, you stop being a net beneficiary from adding additional stories because there are so many stories below from each of which you have to cannibalize space. So there's a natural limit, and then cities impose height limits which often sometimes push substantially below the natural limit. So in Berlin, it's basically 5 stories, and you can see the way that Berlin's all there at 5 stories. It's pretty unmistakable that 5 stories must have been being the binding constraint. It can't possibly be true that it just happened over this huge area that the economically natural limit was 5 stories.
And they're filling in all the courtyards and kind of making the blocks almost completely covered.
Every cubic centimetre of volume they're allowed under the 5 metres is used up, but they don't exist. London is more like an example where they introduced height limits very late in the 1890s, and they're not usually the binding constraints. It's 80 foot plus 2 stories, about 10-story total. There aren't that many 10-story buildings in London in the 1890s, so it's some in the City of London, I think. But in most areas, like what you're describing, like natural economic forces are holding densities below what the limits say anyway. The general reason why height restrictions can't be that tight in the 19th century is because they can only impose one across the entire city area. And this seems to be for political reasons. It's regarded as arbitrary and despotic for the government to take development rights away from some people while granting them to others. So the lowest you can go, so that you can't go lower than you are willing to go in your most dense area. So if you're not prepared to push your city centre below mid-rise, then you're stuck with allowing mid-rise across the entire area of the city, which is in fact what happens in every city except for Bremen.
My understanding also is that other New World cities, so not just the US, but Canada, Australia, New Zealand, not that I think New Zealand had much pressure for building up, but New Zealand and also South America lacked height limits, and therefore you see Buenos Aires is full of like 14-story buildings along their main thoroughfares built in the 1920s and later, of course, but lots of really tall old buildings. And in Melbourne and Sydney, you find really tall old buildings, and you also do in Toronto in a way that don't exist in Berlin, Paris.
That's definitely mostly true. Although I wonder, there may be, like Mexico City doesn't have tall buildings in the downtown, does it? So there may have been places which did have height restrictions, but definitely lots of places beyond the United States which didn't.
There's Sweden or Stockholm or Copenhagen that has one skyscraper, a pair of skyscrapers, like a bridge-like structure.
Yeah, then I think it's in Stockholm. They have a couple, so maybe like 12 stories or something. Maybe I think I have looked at. They're maybe built under some special permission. Some cities also end up with the odd tall building outside the technical city limits, or this kind of like perfect. Europeans were no less capable, and often must have had higher land values because the population was still so much greater. But the height restrictions in European cities are quite an interesting thing, and don't seem to have been that contentious at the time. There wasn't that much pressure for removal, and seem to have arisen. Like exactly why this divergence between New and Old World happened is a bit hazy. Like the justifications for them, like sometimes it was preserving the amenity of the street and preserving light. Sometimes it was sort of fears about congestion. Sometimes it was sort of stuff about fire risk was often adduced. But of course, like why would that have been
New York.
Right? Indeed.
Let me give a hypothesis that I think is interesting. Maybe not true, but here are two factors that I think may have meant there was more pressure for massive densification in the central business districts of New World cities than there was in European cities. And that's the location of those. So point one, location of those cities. If you go through all of the famous cities of the New World, pretty much, New York is on a really constrained island. San Francisco on a really constrained isthmus. As you said, it doesn't actually happen in Boston, but Boston on a heavily constrained plot as well.
I mean, high by
Chicago
cities.
Up against a lake, Melbourne and Sydney up against the sea,
right?
All of Toronto up against a lake.
A settler city effect.
All of these places are up against. Whereas Berlin, in the middle of land, you can go in all four directions. Like Austin or Houston,
London,
Paris, Rome, Madrid. All of them are in the middle, which means they've got four directions to go in, which means they have less pressure for massive densification of their central business district because it can always grow outwards. So there's one hypothesis. And a second hypothesis is that New World cities, because they were planned, they're basically all planned. We're going to get onto that. But the dimension we've talked about is how you're allowed to do whatever you want. But there's an element of which they had much more planning than any of the ancient European cities. All the old European cities, the most economic activity was happening in the oldest parts of the cities, which, for obvious reasons, were hard to add infrastructure to, right? So until the middle of the 20th century, you weren't demolishing well, we'll talk about that, but weren't demolishing too many wide swathes of these cities to put in infrastructure instead. Whereas most of the New World cities came in with wide streets and a grid, which meant that you could get this decentralizing effect where you have all of the economic activity in the center and then the living activity spread out. Whereas in Europe, you see people are still living basically in the central cores way later. You have the mixed use instead of switching into modes.
Yeah, I mean, in some European cities, they never completely displace. Like Paris doesn't really have a central business district even today, right? There's certain arrondissements which are more office space, but still have lots of residents. So it's, what we'd have to check, and I think it may well be, so it's definitely true, New World cities American cities had much better infrastructure. Like tram systems were way better than European cities, huge wide streets, loads, no need, as you say, for the like tortuous interventions that European cities had to try and get. So it may be you had more pressure for commercial downtowns in New World cities, and thus more pressure for densification, create like a hyperdense office district right in the middle, which everyone commutes into, and so correspondingly more political resistance to height limits. That's a thesis, yeah.
So this naturally brings us on to talking about this. So we've talked about how, in a certain sense, European and American and New World cities, the cities of the Victorian era, the cities of the 19th century, were in certain senses, much less planned than the cities of today. So in basically every country today, and certainly in developed countries and in the richest bits of developed countries, there are really stringent restrictions on what you can do with your plot, right? So even in the places that are most permissive, there'll be a volume restriction on how much you can put on that plot, which some places didn't have at all, but certainly these places allowed like 10 times or 100 times what we allowed on nearly every plot today, back in the past. So in this respect, the 19th century was extremely permissive.
The laissez-faire story is kind of true, yeah.
But we've come to the view that in other respects they weren't. Tell me about planning infrastructure.
So the most clearly authoritarian features or planning features of 19th century cities are streets and drains. So we in London can miss a bit of this because London's street network was not planned by a particular central authority, although it was tightly regulated by lots of parliamentary laws. But most of the great cities around the world basically had plans created by the authorities for their street network. Americans will know this because obviously all American cities have grid patterns, and those don't arise spontaneously from lots of landowners just deciding on it. So the general system was the private developer would lay out the streets, and then the streets were adopted by the local government, so that they'd hand them over to the local government once they were finished, and then the local government overtakes responsibility for maintenance. The question was how the layout of the streets gets determined. And you do see there are cases where they just leave private developers, private landowners to lay out their own street networks. But the problem is when you have lots of different private landowners next to each other, they struggle to coordinate to create a well-integrated street network. And sometimes there are classic collective action problems where for each individual landowner, it's optimal to basically have a cul-de-sac. You can feed off whatever system of public roads exists, but deny any kind of through traffic through your area and the amenity disruption that has to your residents. But if everyone tries to create a city out of cul-de-sacs, you end up with a city where there's no through traffic for anyone. That's nowhere evolves quite like that, but lots of places evolve a bit like that.
I think you're understating that. That is, I would say, the default way of that development around the world exists. If you look at the median development happening now in South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, which is where most development in the world is happening, then you will find that it looks like that. That's 90% of world development that's happening right now. Only 10% is being planned. Strangely enough, Samuel and I recently discovered that Mogadishu is one of the best planned cities in Africa. And it's really actually weird how different places at a similar development level are. So, for example, Kenya, fairly well planned, has lots of high-rise. Ghana, pure cul-de-sac shanty additions to towns on the edges of town. And there's no obvious, you wouldn't reason from just knowing a little bit about Kenya and Ghana, Kenya has got much better planned cities. You probably would if you knew something about Africa, but if you're just a totally ignorant person like me, you would have no reason to believe that going into it.
This is true in the 19th century as well. you wouldn't immediately guess that Germany and Spain would have fairly well-planned cities, and France and Britain would have much less planned cities, and then like the United States would have its system of perfectly regular grids. Like the States, you might just about guess because it's a settler society and they're building the cities from scratch. But like the pattern in Europe is a bit mysterious, so not immediately obvious why it ended up that way. So it's, yeah, my best. I mean, I don't. The short, like, I don't actually know exactly why it happened. It may be small elites for quite contingent reasons determine, and then societies end up on like dependent paths. The other thing I think sometimes is countries with particularly fragmented land ownership are forced to create a system for developing street networks. And then they leapfrog the countries which had relatively unified land ownership and weren't forced to develop a system for land assembly.
So what you're saying is that in Britain, there were lots of large landholders like the Grosvenor family.
Yeah, exactly.
And they owned sufficiently large units that when they were planning them for themselves, they actually had more or less the incentives of a well-run local government and planned something like if you go around the Belgravia or the new town in Edinburgh or something like that. These planned by private developers.
Well, Edinburgh was the corporation, but most of the like suburbs of London were private developers. And they did do stuff like put gates around all the squares to try and stop through traffic. So they definitely did have some of these collective action problems. And London's street network is worse for transport purposes than Madrid's or Berlin's. But like basically, the West End has an okay street system, even quite a good street system, because they had fairly substantial landowners. Whereas lots of cities, it depends on which area, but like especially eastern Spain, the Spanish coasts, and western Germany, you have countries where land ownership is fragmented through partible inheritance, where you split when someone dies, their land is split equally among all their sons, and so these tiny estates, tiny like landholdings that had come down to the 19th century, where it was basically impossible to build any kind of city out of this. And then the authorities, well, we're going to have to develop a system, and so they develop a mechanism for doing this. The mechanism they develop is quite clever. So the normal system was the authorities draw up a plan called, in German, the Fluchtlinienplan, so the plan of the lines of flight plan. And then they announce it, and then as soon as it's promulgated, all the land that's been marked for the future street network of the city is sterilized for development, so the owners are forbidden from building anything on that land. The land adjacent to it, they're also not really allowed to build on unless they lay out the streets on the designated street areas and cede them to the city. So it looks at first like the poor landowners are getting a really bad deal because they're having a load of their land is getting sterilized, and the rest of it they're only getting conditional rights. And to satisfy the condition, they've got to grade the streets and hand them over to the authorities. But the upside for them is they're then just allowed to enjoy all the uplift on the remaining land, which benefits from having an integrated street network. And so the landowners there were exceptions, but for the most part, landowners are just pretty happy with the situation and don't kick up much of a fuss. So that system is widely, so the European countries that use this, Spain, Germany, preeminent, Italy uses it quite a lot, and it later spreads to the United States. I think early on the Americans were more likely to use a more aggressive compulsory purchase, where the state just seizes
a bunch of
all
New
the
York
environments.
is aggressive.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
Purchase,
the famous commissioner's plan, which I think may have worked better because there were only a few landowners and it was so obvious where their interests lay. But then they switch over to this more soft touch system where the landowners are basically, their incentive is to do the city's work for it without compulsory purchase being used. And so the landowners busily set about grading the streets and handing them over to the city as fast as possible so they can start to realize the uplift on the rest of the land.
But they could farm it if they wanted to.
Yeah, it would never be expropriated from them. The state might seize a few key streets where like holdout problems would paralyze the whole city's infrastructure or something. But basically the rest of it, you can continue doing what you're doing at the moment. It won't get taken away from you. So you live in an area of London which is kind of like this, right? So there was mysteriously, it's mostly 19th century, but there was a parcel of land which just wasn't developed till well into the 20th century.
Yes. Blackheath, where I live, is substantially built in the 1970s when there were lots of open fields next to it. Actually, it's a good example here of somewhere which, in my opinion, is a lot worse for its lack of planning. It's very much got a village character which is good in certain respects. But what it means is that there's only one street connecting Greenwich, where there are lots of major roads and there is lots of traffic, and Lewisham, Lee, Kidbrooke, everywhere south of Blackheath, 4 miles in each direction. You have to go like 2 miles in one direction and 1.5 miles in the other direction to get any through road at all, which means that Blackheath has an awful lot of traffic, which means that it's not a particularly nice centre relative to how nice it could be because there aren't alternative roads. And I think about places nearby where they were built all in one go by the Victorians on a large plot, and they have 4 or 5 roads doing the same thing because it's a grid.
Yes, I mean, it's worth saying like something about how the unplanned cities or semi-planned cities are different to the planned ones. So in the case of America, it's obvious, like giant grid system, extremely wide roads, very, very clearly different to London or Paris. In the case of European cities, it's more like they have a system of these long axial boulevards. Actually, Berlin is probably the model. Madrid also pretty good. I mean, Barcelona's a bit like this. Milan is like this. Big, wide streets capable of taking, not in those days, not cars, but like substantial volume of trams and buses and carts and so on. And then you have side streets where people live. And, you know, we Londoners often, whereas in London, basically you had the old medieval system of arterial roads, like little country lanes, and the farmers around them would gradually build up their house, sell their land to developers and build up as housing estates, and the little country lanes would gradually get turned into arterial roads and like asphalted by the council. But you ended up with extremely limited road capacity relative to a continental city, and this, you know, is bad from a transport engineering point of view, and also, as Ben points out, like maybe bad from an amenity point of view, because the thing you get so often in London of like the high street is not actually a very nice space. There's too much traffic choking it. It's like the weird effect you get in so many places where the streets around are full of £2 million houses, and the high street feels like quite kind of decayed. This is, you know, to some extent an artifact of 19th century planning, which just didn't leave enough space for this and ended up with them being too crowded and too congested. The caveat is, both in Britain and in France, the government does do lots of ad hoc road building. So they build the famous private roads, the turnpikes. Well, those built by private companies, but with powers given to them by the government, which add the circulation in rural areas. And then they also sometimes will cut roads through the city centre. And Paris is the most famous example of this, where the various governments slice large roads through the centre of the city to improve traffic circulation. And London does it to about the same extent, although much less spectacularly.
The Embankment, Shaftesbury Avenue, Regent Street. I'm sure we could think of more.
Marble Arch,
Victoria Street, the whole family of them. So it's those are a similar kind of traffic planning to what's going on the continent, but done in this very ad hoc way, not done with like a big document where you can see there's one map which says these are where all the roads of the city are going to be. And it leads to cities operating better than they would have done if they'd had nothing like that, but still less well than they did in countries which had more of it. So this was my first, surprise. Turns out that 19th century governments were highly activist on street planning, and did it all, they were like, these plans have a slightly Soviet quality to them, where you can literally look at this document and it has all the future road networks of the next half century laid out in front of you. The same thing is basically true with drains. That was the other thing where they couldn't find any way of getting private enterprise to do it. But private companies would provide a little drain for the one street they were building.
I guess they just drain it off into the public commons and leave
into
people to deal with
the
it.
nearby stream generally. Or they just leave people to rely on the old system of having storing their waste in cesspits and having it collected by.
I thought this was quite interesting. So at what point do people stop? At what point do people start paying for people to take their excrement away? Because you hear about like old-timey sort of plague-ridden European cities where people are just throwing their bedpans out the window.
I think that probably never happened that much. And certainly by the early modern period, that's not happening.
The early modern period?
By the 18th century, that's not happening. So it's not happening very much. You'd find like back alleys where people do it surreptitiously, but it wasn't legal. The system is partly, so there's a whole bunch of verbal confusions here. So one thing is people hear the phrase, popular history, obviously like...
I read the horrible histories.
Right. popular historians love terrorizing people with stories of the personal hygiene in the past, and everyone finds it very I can't imagine how awful it was. So one trick is to say these cities had open sewers, and people would dump wastewater into open sewer. Now this is true, but a sewer just meant any open waterway, so any stream counted as a sewer. And you were allowed to dump wastewater, but not the so-called black water, so human waste. You were allowed to dump grey water, which is like water you'd use for washing or cooking or something. And it was illegal to dump black water in. So London was indeed full of open sewers, and they played a vital role in clearing away all its waste, but not really in a very grotesque way. Like, they were just streams, and people were putting their cooking and cleaning water into the streams, and then the streams were flowing away, and the waste was being stored in cesspits. And then people would either pay for it to be. The economic model was obviously people paid for it to be taken away, but also farmers paid for it to be brought to them because it was extremely valuable fertilizer. So it's quite a profitable industry with removing that system. Is basically an okay system in lots of contexts. There's amazingly little consumer demand for getting rid of it. People are seem happy enough with it. In some places, it lasts for ages. Like Japan still uses it in the post-war period. The Australian city of Brisbane apparently keeps using it till the 1970s. They just, for some reason, they never got around to it, or it was so low density that building a modern sewage system was a bit of a pain.
So
or
what,
something.
People's toilets empty into some communal sewage tank, and then people, I guess, in trucks drive and take it away?
Just on their own house.
Okay.
They, or they have, privies of some kind, empty into a pit, brick-lined pit, and then it gets taken away by a person called a gong farmer, or a nightman, and then they take it away in wagons. It's the gong farmers were apparently, I don't think it was the most agreeable job, but they were apparently very well paid, and
because it's not a very agreeable job.
And they were quite a fierce lobby against introducing modern sewage systems, because obviously that would wipe out their business. They and the farmers were pushed against it. There are even some cases. There was one German city, I think Dusseldorf, where the city built its new system, its new piping system, but it was only used for draining public spaces of like rainwater and so on. They didn't allow people to plug in privately to it because the gong lobby had lobbied so fiercely against it that to preserve their own interests.
So we have the yes case, the laissez-faire case of what you could do with your plots. They were pretty laissez-faire, extreme laissez-faire in like New York, and then quite laissez-faire in the most authoritarian parts of Europe, like Germany or Spain. But they were still you could do pretty much what you wanted.
Yeah.
Then on the extreme other end, we have basically Soviet or CCCP style 50-year plans for where all the buildings will go and where the roads will go and what infrastructure will be built where. These were two important elements of success of what I keep calling the Victorian model. I don't know whether you can, I should actually use the word Victorian to describe the whole world, because it was the whole world, not just England in the 19th century.
But the sun never set on the British Empire.
Yeah, and it did actually cover, I suppose, Australia and New Zealand and South Africa and various other places as well.
The term Victorian is used a bit in continental Europe because Queen Victoria has such like brand power, and people do feel this curious woman with her intense piety and her like strong public spirited notions and her has something of the kind of unstylishness of the Victorians as well, this kind of heaviness and the dark colours and this kind. Like, she works really well as a brand icon for the period, and so I think the usage has spread. So I think we may allow ourselves the term without being parochial.
Fair enough. Although I'm going to try and say 19th century anyway. So on the one end, we've got Baufreiheit, freedom to build whatever you like, general rule. So laissez-faire, they get 1 point for that. On the other hand, you have municipal socialism for drains and roads, and to some extent for other kinds of infrastructure as well. But I gather there is a middle point where it would be hard to put it in either of those buckets, because it has certain features of cutthroat capitalism and certain features of municipal socialism. And you might even say it's like the Judge Glock or the Tom Forth. If you to choose an English character, Tom Forth, choose an American, Judge Glock. Their story is what comes out the most here. So this is like running public services, but for a profit.
Yeah, so it's transport and utilities. And they start out as pretty laissez-faire on this as well. So whenever a new like piped water, electricity, gas are invented, or a new transport mode is invented, railways, trams, buses, they start out leaving it more or less to private companies to do what they like, and they encounter a couple of key problems. One is that private companies, so they're engaged in frenzied competition against each other. They bid down their prices quite low. Normally, we think that's a good thing. Like, obviously, what you want is companies to be pushing their prices down. The issue with transport is you sometimes end up with less transport as a result than would be maximally efficient. So the reason for this is, like, imagine if I take the train to go to a wood and go for a walk by myself, then I'm getting all the pleasure from my journey, and the transport company has the same power that any like consumer-facing business has to capture the value of my journey from me through charging me a fare. But if I go to visit my grandmother, then I get value from visiting my grandmother, but my grandmother also gets value from me going to visit her. And the transport company can't bill my grandmother for this. Like, it has very little way of capturing value from her. And there's loads and loads, like nearly everything we travel for. In fact, we're traveling to do things with other people. And the transport provider can only ever get the value capture from the person doing the traveling, not from the many more people to whom they travel. And so there is a tendency for the free market to underprovide the transport services relative to what would be maximized social value. That's your first market failure. And the reason, now they don't have a completely developed theory of this, but they realize like the competition is causing prices to crash to somehow like an obviously unhealthy or crazy level. Like, we're underfunding our services, we're not having any money for investment, something's going wrong here. So they work out in like they have like a folk understanding of a market failure going on there.
I guess you also have a problem of duplicating things.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, this is the more entertaining one. So classic example is, imagine a beach. Imagine people are evenly distributed along the length of the beach. You start out with 2 ice cream vans, 1/3 of the way along the beach each. Now, left ice cream van thinks, what if I move down to the middle of the beach? I'll be able to capture a whole bunch of people in the middle of the beach from my arrival, but all the people to the left of me are still stuck going to me, so I've just gained from this. Guy on the right, obviously, is like, well, I'm not going to let this happen, so he too moves to the middle of the beach. And in the end, the 2 ice cream vans end up right in the middle of the beach next to each other. They've each still got only 50% beach share, but for half the people on the beach, they're now much further from the ice cream van than they were previously, and they're getting a worse service. So this is a pattern for markets with a certain structure for the different providers to converge in the kind of good that they provide, such that the consumers ultimately end up with a worse range of products than would be socially optimal. This happens pervasively with transport. So the most picturesque example is in Kent, where there's 2 railway companies going from London, building railway systems to Kent. And they basically build duplicative systems arriving at different London termini, going to much the same places in Kent on systems like the government forces them to allow their lines to cross each other sometimes. Although even that, obviously, they're very unwilling and would prefer to block each other from crossing. And they refuse to use shared alignments. They refuse to and the Kent ends up with basically 2 duplicative rail systems, providing very little additional value over one railway system, and far less value than they might have done if they used the same quantity of capital but spread it out to reach a wider range of places or to provide more interconnections. That's what constantly happens when they introduce these new, massive systems of infrastructure, utilities and transport. And what they realize, again, they don't hoteling is the economist who first describes this formally in the 1930s, I think. He doesn't exist yet. They don't have they can't call it hotelingist law. But again, there's a folk theory appears. Well, hang on, Kent's got an insane system. Obviously, we need to coordinate this somehow. This is clearly extremely wasteful. And so their economics is badly formalized, but in fact quite good in a kind of working way.
So Japan has mostly privatized rail. Does Japan have this problem?
Ben, you might know more about it than I. I suspect the systems are tightly, the alignments are tightly controlled by the authorities.
I think it's more of a trade-off than Samuel is giving it credit for.
Uh-huh.
I think that while an optimal system definitely has one provider, then you rely on your wise, foresighted municipal socialists to build you the exact correct network, and they're not always forthcoming. Whereas And also, on the other hand, that you don't necessarily compete prices down to efficient levels afterwards. They might be too low under the system with competition, but they can also be too high under the system without competition. So I think that the upside of this system we had in England and Japan, in Britain, actually, across the whole of Britain, and in Japan, where there were many private companies competing, fighting to give alignment, to get alignments, and then often. So, for example, to take an example, I gather that there are 3 entirely separate lines between Osaka and Kyoto, and which are obviously now part of the same like huge urban agglomeration, but by the time they were built, there was countryside in between them. That means that the services between there have been forced to get better and better and better, and they have the best service in the country is on that specific spine because competition works. Now, the downside, of course, is that like there's wasteful duplication. And I think the wasteful duplication problem is probably larger in infrastructure than in other areas. But of course, it is a feature of all markets we have is there's wasteful duplication, right? Like it would probably, in a sense, it would be better if there were not 2 companies trying to provide us shoes or cars or whatever, because they're investing all the same R&D efforts twice. They're building up all these factories. They could be doing it at one more efficient scale. Loads of their products get forced down to fire sale prices because they don't sell and all those sorts of things.
I mean, one issue with infrastructure may be that if you have 2 companies which are initially duplicating lots of the same overheads and they engage in struggle with each other, and then if it's a natural monopoly, one company eventually conquers the other, or if it's a natural duopoly, there's a bunch of companies at first and you end up with 2 companies that are competing later. Like it's fairly easy for them to then cut the overheads and achieve a more efficient supply system later on. With lots of kinds of infrastructure, it's tortuously difficult, maybe kind of impossible in lots of ways. So like Kent today, eventually the 2 railway companies merge in the early 20th century, and now they've all been nationalised, so obviously they're owned by the same organisation that owns all British Railways. But they've still got a lot of crazy alignments. Like it's been a little bit rationalised over time, but it's politically so difficult to get a new alignment or to close an alignment once an alignment exists.
Alignment just being the right of way, the space on which a railway lives, or a road, in fact, any piece of infrastructure.
So I think often with infrastructure, it's got its weirdly like for funny political reasons to do with how invasive of space it is and how dependent people become upon it. It's got a kind of weird one-shot game character where your fragmented market results in a permanently inefficient endowment of alignments afterwards. Whereas in other economic sectors, yeah, you're always being efficient at first, but you get lots of the consolidation later.
I guess infrastructure's got more complicated externalities, right? Like people don't really want a new train line right next to their house. You've got to do the thing we were talking about earlier, where you've got to compulsorily purchase or find some like weird scheme to pay people off. So you can see why it's more wasteful than having like an extra shoe factory. Although people are very concerned about excess fashion that people are producing and throwing into landfill and stuff as well. So potentially it's the same kind of problem.
You get some elements of it, but not anything like the same intensity. And like closing a factory when to consolidate into a bigger factory, like, yes, people will complain. Yes, it's just about possible that the government might intervene and stop them from closing it. But on the whole, that doesn't happen, and they are allowed to do this. Whereas closing down a piece of transport or utilities infrastructure, you really like it's an era-defining thing when that happens, and you get a huge amount of. So there are some special features of it in this respect. There's also the fact, like the 2 market failures here are related. If indeed competitive pricing results in underinvestment relative to what's efficient, then one of the key advantages of competition in other cases is not in fact an advantage in this case. And at any rate, the view they arrive at is you do want there to be a single provider of these kinds of infrastructure either per like a large area of a city or for a whole city. Not usually of all the kinds of infrastructure, but per transport mode or per infrastructure, like a utility type. And they find various different ways of producing this. So some countries set up like state-owned companies that do it. This is the German model. Some countries have a franchise system where just one private company is given the right by the government to build and run infrastructure. That's the American model. Some countries have a concession system where the government owns the infrastructure but gives out leases to private companies or concessions to private companies to operate it for sort of periods of 20 years or something. all of these systems, they sound very different, but all these systems share the basic features that they are funded by user fees, not through taxpayer subsidies. The companies that operate them usually make money from operating them, even including, interestingly, the municipal governments. So the municipal companies were normally profit-making, and the local taxpayers were very keen for them to expand infrastructure operations and raise prices and get more out of the business so that they could then cut taxes with the proceeds from it. At least they were sometimes keen. Obviously, the politics were complicated then, even as they would be later. So profit-seeking, paid for through user fees, and owned by a single provider. The ownership structure was quite different in the different cases, but the behavioral patterns that they ended up with were surprisingly similar. And although these companies were aiming to maximize, their own, the private companies were definitely aiming to maximize their own profits, and the state-owned ones were often, to a large extent, aiming at that. They end up with behavioral patterns that seem to be fairly close to being value maximizing for the city as a whole, because they're very keen to provide infrastructure. They provide as much of it as possible, but they provide a unified kind of infrastructure for the whole city because they don't succumb to hoteling problems, because if you don't want to cannibalize people from your other line because you also own that line, so your incentives are to space out your lines in an efficient way across the city.
Are there other markets where we like these monopolies? I'm thinking France's energy market, EDF, that seems to be run by, at the very least, a private company that is a monopoly. I think a couple of health insurance things are like this in countries where they have mandatory insurance. I think Israel, they make you have, there are 4 insurers, so limiting the number of insurance providers. I think Singapore does the same with about 3 or 4 as well, possible different providers that you can have.
Here's what I think is the best parallel.
Mm-hmm.
Drug development. So in drug development, we recognize that the fixed costs of developing the drug in the first place are so large, like the fixed costs of building out a gas grid or building out a railway network, that we think that our usual desire to have lots of competition, even at the cost of wasteful duplication, isn't worth it. And we should therefore give them a monopoly for 20 years and then let everyone copy them for free afterwards, so that no one at any point puts any investment in to develop the same drug twice, because otherwise we'd be developing the same drug twice. It might not be worth doing. We wouldn't get the drug in the first place. And so we try and there are loads of features of this market that work exactly the same way. So, for example, if you had spies in all your competitors and we didn't have this kind of protection, you would hear, yes, they're bringing out a GLP-1 drug. They're going to conquer, and they've proven that it works. So we should quickly do all the experiments because we know we'll find out that it works. Run up the same drug, and maybe we can even rush it to market slightly before them. But even if we can't rush it to market slightly before them, we can rush it to market just after them and capture half of the market. And
isn't that what happened?
No. They developed a second GLP-1 because they thought the market would be sufficiently big enough, or because they thought that they could improve upon the existing one. And in fact, it turns out that the developments were all worth doing. But usually what happens with a drug is that it gets released straight away. So everyone, because you have to protect it, in order to protect it, you have to tell everyone you're working on it. So people have an incentive to give it out the first moment they're considering developing a drug like X or Y. Then everyone else realizes, well, if we do develop an alternative, we'd have to get it through all the stages within the 20-year period by which this has gone out of patent. And after that 20 years, we and anyone else can create a generic for almost no cost, and there'll be no market to capture. And so it's designed, the institutions may not be perfect, but they're designed basically around the exact same economic principle of there's no point having 2 of very similar drugs, and especially at the cost of billions of extra investment that drug company investors have to put in. That's the same. And I think the key feature here is fixed costs. Right, so the key point about railways is that you can't just pick them up again and put them down somewhere else. You can't reconsolidate and make it efficient afterwards. You get the alignments that you're stuck with, and getting them in the first place was so expensive that we actively don't want people to wastefully duplicate them too much, in a way that we're usually willing to take the costs of wasteful duplication. In fact, I am constantly arguing that we should have more wasteful duplication within the state sector. I think that there's not enough government bureaucracy wasteful duplication. In my experience, if you find yourself talking to a civil servant, especially a senior civil servant, then saying, we're not doing this, they'll say, what are you talking about? There is the XYZ pathway we invented in 2004. And you can use that to do exactly the thing you're talking about. And I'll always say, well, if we're not doing it, then that means it's a bad pathway. We should have a second one. Or whenever the state is most effective, like with Operation Warp Speed in the US, or with the Vaccine Task Force in the UK, or indeed with like DARPAs when they've set them up, and ARPA-E in the US, particularly effective bits of state infrastructure, they have usually been a new institution competing to provide a state service that's already being provided. And so we often need more wasteful duplication. But I agree that infrastructure is a case where, at least per mode, we generally, like sometimes you want two. I think that Chicago, New York, for example, and Manchester, Liverpool were such important train spines that in the Victorian era, it was worth having two separate competing companies. And maybe it may have been true for Tokyo to Osaka or whatever as well. But in general, now that we have roads and airplanes as well, one is enough.
Of course, there were competition did find ways of working its, so under the concession system, your concession expires after 20 years, and then the state can renew it, or you can give it to one of your competitors. And France has these two giant companies, which interestingly still exist. Veolia, lots of, we probably all have our bins collected by Veolia. This is a 19th century French company that originates as a concessionaire for French utilities. Those two companies were indeed ferociously in competition and would fight like crazy to get the best contract, to offer, to get the contracts from the towns by ultimately, through, among other things, through price cutting. So you did, and the franchises in the States did the same thing. With the state-owned companies, that would be less true in a way, although you still get competition between towns or competition between modes, as there's often the different bits of the sector would be in different bits of the different transport modes might be in competition with each other. And then, of course, 19th century municipalities could go bankrupt, and the state would never bail them out if they did. So they overall still have sort of some kind of quasi-competitive incentives in place.
I think the way I would say it is that they have competitive incentives between them and other municipalities, right? What people I don't think mentally internalize, especially in the UK, where we've lost most of our competitive features of local governments. But I think in lots of countries, they're muted to at least some degree compared to the local governments of the 19th century. In the 19th century, it wasn't just that you thought, if we grow, I can produce this great public good, or I'll be able to build a big, like a wonderful park or plaza in the centre. But I'm sure those things did exist, and there was urban pride. And so there were positive goals people wanted. But there were also negative worries they had, which were, if my tax base thins out enough, then I won't be able to provide like really basic stuff, or we'll go bankrupt. And that might personally affect me. Some of these corporations, the trustees were individual rich people
earlier on. Yeah.
Later, that wasn't true. But so I think that worries about losing your tax base were really important. So there was competition between places. But the other feature is not, I wouldn't call it competition per se, but like evolutionary dynamics, the fear of being wiped out, or not even just the fear of being wiped out, but the fact you could get wiped out and then replaced by something else. Those two things put together are why we get success, I think, in normal markets. One is competition, but if competition doesn't work on you and you don't improve your game, then you get liquidated and all your capital gets redistributed to someone else. And that both of those things were working on the local governments in most countries of the 19th century, right?
Now yes. I mean, how far are there examples of this continuing today?
I think that you can more or less describe American and Swiss local government as working under kind of these features. Arguably French local government in some respects as well, but it's more complicated, especially since French local government has ebbed and flowed in its powers. I believe lots of them were brought in the Gaston Defferre reforms of the 1980s, and then lots of them were taken away in 2018 by Macron, or at least lots of their incentives were taken away. So it's complicated. But the countries with most powerful local government historically have always been Switzerland and the US, and I think they still mostly have all of these features, like local governments are fear going bust. And also local governments in Switzerland very explicitly compete to get residents with each other with tax rates and so on.
I see.
We've discussed three features of local governments of the 19th century. One is that they were very laissez-faire about what you could build on a given plot. They let you do pretty much what you wanted with limited binding constraints in most places. 2 is that they were very social plannery. They had 5-year or 50 or 100-year plans for where you could build and where infrastructure would be. And they planned in much higher amounts of space for infrastructure and public uses than the free market planned in the places that the free market planned. And then the third thing is that where there were public services that weren't public goods, like infrastructure, or that weren't extremely high in terms of their spillover effects, they charged for them and in a profit-making way. Now, I think we don't just think that these happened to be features of cities when they grew at their fastest rates, but actually were part of why they were able to grow at those fastest rates. And I'll give an argument for. So one of them is obvious.
I think we should spell out quite how fast they grew during this time period. I was surprised to learn that like Chicago grew by like 5,000% or something ridiculous like that.
So New World cities are the most extreme cases. Obviously, slightly artificial if you give them in percentage figures because they started out as nothing.
Oh yeah, it was like 20 people,
right?
Yeah.
From whatever point you started. But like, Chicago is a city with well over 1 million people by 1914. Of having been nothing at all until about 1830. And this is lots and lots of major New World. New York starts the 19th century with 60,000 people, and it ends it as a gigantic city with many millions of people.
I guess it's a time when basically population was exploding across Europe and America and like basically all over the world. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised. And also everything is industrializing and urbanizing as well.
But you might say those things are kind of the other way around, right? So like you might say that we could have had a system whereby, like Samuel uncovered a really fun example once of the cowocracy of Nottingham. So it turned out that the farmers, the cattle ranchers is really the wrong word, but the cattle grazers outside Nottingham, which is a big city in the East Midlands in the UK, the cattle grazers outside Nottingham had this weird collective ownership of the fields, such that they couldn't sell the fields off to expansion like anyone else could have done. They could only collectively decide, and there would always be one guy who said, no, we shouldn't do it. And so Nottingham was constrained in a way that most English cities were not. And you can compare it to like Derby or Sheffield, nearby cities, to see how different it was.
It became incredibly densely built up and overcrowded by 1830s or where. Like it was a continental, like a heavily walled city on the continent where like every cubic meter had been filled with, half a dozen children and this guy. And then finally they burst through. The Parliament passed legislation overcoming the cowocracy, and the city exploded outwards very rapidly.
Yeah, it has actually a really nice centre. If anyone would like to visit somewhere nice in the East Midlands, I think Nottingham is particularly
Nottingham's a really
good.
nice town. Yeah.
But I think things like that could have existed everywhere, right? So urbanization wasn't just a background force that was destined to happen. Urbanization was permitted by building the places those people could move to at least some extent. And so I think partly building great urban centres was a part of how those urban centres got populated.
Yeah.
And I don't know about rural population growth, like to what extent I want to claim that was partly driven by there being city jobs for their children to go to. But I think something like economic growth being high, which is partly about urban centres creating things to sell and buy around the world,
also,
is relevant to...
Would we have got the Haber-Bosch process without urban centres?
Yeah.
Like loads of questions like that end up
exactly.
existing.
And like a lot of the things about rural population growth was in continental Europe to some extent hemmed in by death before the 19th century, and still after then in lots of places. So it might have been that the people would have just died and not been able to move to the cities if so I feel like it's interlinked a bit more than just being a background feature, although that clearly is relevant. Something would have happened, but I don't think it had to happen the way it did, and probably the institutions were a part of the story about how they pulled it off.
The other thing to say is urban growth is outstripping population growth. So the average size of a home falls steadily in the 19th century. I think in the start, when Queen Victoria comes to the throne, the average British family probably has about 5 kids, and they're living in probably 2 rooms, and they, without any running water.
That's exactly how my mother grew up.
Is that right?
5 kids, 2 rooms.
5 kids, 2 rooms. Well, and I mean, India's probably undergoing change at a similar rate to Victorian England. By the time of her death, the average family is living in 4 or 5 rooms, and they dropped to probably 3 kids, which is probably not wildly far off, at least in southern India today.
Oh,
So
no, it's way lower. They're having 1 child in South
right,
India.
well, there you are. Yeah, so it's so huge improvement in housing quality at the same time as an enormous increase in urban population. And also the thing that Ben mentioned earlier, the share of public space is rising in these cities. So they've got larger streets, more. They didn't, cities in 1830 barely have public parks. By the First World War, they've got lots of public parks, lots more public buildings. Like a city of 1800, very, very highly privatized space. You've got roads and churches. That's basically your public sphere. And then nearly everything else is houses and some shops, I guess. A much wider range of public buildings that have appeared by the end of the century.
And to be honest, shops, presumably many fewer. There'd be lots of, like, poor people might buy things from the street, from street sellers. Rich people would have stuff delivered to their house and made by their internal servants.
True, yeah.
So there weren't that many public shop spaces. Like, retail isn't really a thing. And you can see this in poorer countries today, that there aren't many retail spaces. Very rich people get a lot of stuff made in-house and delivered to them, and very poor people buy from street sellers. But there isn't much of a, like, if you go to the big cities of the developing world, they often don't have large shopping districts, or like there isn't that area that's that color in Google Maps of go here, there are retail bits. That doesn't exist in lots of middle and low income cities.
I mean, there were certainly markets in European cities and market streets, but stuff like a department store is a 19th century invention and was a huge deal when it appeared. So that was part of the creation of public space. So vast populations living in bigger homes and with more public spaces to enjoy. So tremendous rate of building that underlies this, far greater than Western cities see today, comparable to what fast-growing developing world cities see today.
If you were in New York or something, you were building 10 elevated railway lines, which then turn into 10 subway lines or whatever, plus 10 heavy rail lines, plus 50 tram lines, plus building up a huge bus system, plus you were building up like hundreds of pipelines of gas and of building in coal in crazy amounts and building the steam network, and building houses at a much, much faster rate than built today, all at the same time.
I mean, the developing world comparison is interesting, right? Because people asked me after I worked on this, okay, so what? Can we go back to this? And for Western countries, it's like, yes, maybe in parts, but like politics are extremely complicated. Lots of these institutions are very hard to get back to once you've lost them. And we talked a lot before about NIMBYism and where it comes from and how strong it is and how deep its roots are in modern societies. Developing world cities are often growing at the same rate as 19th century European cities. And they do have sporadic, like, tremendous successes on infrastructure, like the huge wave of Asian metros that have been built in the last 25 years. But there are also, we ran a piece by Sarthak Gupta on like road share in developing world cities, which is drastically lower than it was in 19th century European cities. Extremely strangely, given that the number of cars that exist in private vehicles that exist in the developing world today is far greater than the number of private vehicles that existed in the 19th century.
European planners didn't even have the bicycle to contend with in most cases. It hadn't been invented yet, let alone the bicycle, moped, motorcycle, car, and all these other things. They just had carts, which outside of the Americas were very rare, and less than 10% of people had access to one. In the US, strangely enough, horse ownership. I like to say, this is like a real Ben Southwood canard, I like to say that car ownership has always been high in the USA. And what I mean by that is that horse and cart ownership was so dramatically higher than in Europe.
Is that right?
That I think it was visible in their cities a long time before you see the effects of car ownership. And the key way in which you see it is that if you look at these New England towns built in the 1600s and 1700s, if they had been built in Europe, every house would have been adjoined. Everyone would have minimized the amount of space that you're spending. If you look at planned towns from Europe in the 1600s, like Richelieu in France, or what was that earthquake-destroyed, replanned Baroque city in Sicily? But we could come up with the name if we thought about it hard enough. All of these cities are built around the idea that you are going to need to walk to where you're going if you're 95% of people, and therefore we should minimize the distance between where you're going and you. Whereas these American towns, people would build their farmhouses basically isolated, even in 1600 and 1700. Right? It doesn't matter how far back you go; they're still building detached houses. And my hypothesis is that this is because of a very high rate of horse and cart ownership, which is about a quarter of people had access to horse and cart.
So why did they have so many horses, so many carts?
Because the population density was so low that you could use land around towns and cities for fodder growth, so clover and alfalfa and stuff like that, and just feed it to your horses. And interestingly enough, this means that when the car is developed in the US and car ownership does go up, about some size, like hundreds of millions of acres, are reforested after that point, because it's previously required to be alfalfa or clover growth, and then it can be reforested because it's become leisure forests for Americans.
So the forests that surround the cities of New England would previously chiefly have been horse fodder.
Horse fodder until the early 20th century. Enormous amounts of horse fodder everywhere. And so the car actually led to much more land going back to nature, even though, of course, it led to lots of roads and all those sorts of things.
I have another question, which is, okay, so almost all the European and American cities, and I guess Australia as well, put lots of land aside for roads. But the developing world cities now, even though they have the information about how good roads are, don't seem to be doing this. Do we have like a good story about why that's happened?
So if Sarthak were here, I think he would say this in a much more reasonable, nuanced and balanced way than I'm about to do. But because I'm speaking for him, I can just say it in like a really reductionist and unreasonable way. But I think he would say that they get very bad advice from international elites. International elites are thinking about what are the problems that Western cities are facing now. And one of those problems is that those cities were not built for the car and then got invaded by the car and have only partly reconfigured themselves to have both the benefits of cars and avoid most of their downsides. And so they're very fixated on the downsides of cars specifically, not thinking, I think, about the fact that you can't just jump to being Denmark or Sweden. There are often stages you need to go through. So what Sarthak argues that they should do is set aside wide alignments, accept that in the short run, motorcycles, mopeds, bicycles, cars will use them in a fairly unplanned way, and then recognize that in the late 19th century, Manhattan, New York City, was building out its railway network. And one thing that any British person feels when they go around New York subway is that it's extremely squalid, and like, why is it so degraded and decayed? But another thing they think is that, wow, these express trains sure are great, and you can skip stops and on the same network and jump off one into the other, and they can be cross-platform exchanges, and you can run like, how come we can't do this? And the reason we can't do this is because we had to tunnel bore most of our network, which means that the wider your bore is increasing like in the square of its diameter, or more than the square. So you want to minimize the bore. So you have these horrible tiny little Victoria Line trains that you squeeze onto, and everyone's whereas the subway is just dug under an extremely wide street. And like, well, we could put 4 tracks here. Hey, like some streets they could probably put 6 tracks. So that's a big advantage that you have. And there's a general point there, which is that yes, you may start out with a wide street full of crowded motorcycle traffic. Maybe this is something you'd like, tuk-tuks even, or rickshaws and jitneys and stuff going through, and maybe this is something you don't want. But you can always turn that, if you have it, into something else. If you don't have it, it's very hard to get it later. It's very hard to, like, pulling off Houseman and the Metropolitan Board of Works and cutting a road is really hard. Like, the Egyptians would love to do it through their cities, and they occasionally achieve it against kicking and screaming of thousands and thousands of people, and they'd love to have more rights of way, but they don't.
I'm guessing also they haven't had generations and generations of primogeniture the same way we did when we were doing this. So also they've got way more fractured land ownership already that is making the political problem harder.
I mean, fractured land ownership is basically a universal world problem that a tiny number of countries, basically England and then Britain, have got, because it's not Britain originally, because I believe that Scottish inheritance was more likely to follow Roman partibility. So, although actually it was concentrated for other reasons, so I don't know. I actually don't know the story of Scotland very well, but it's not necessarily a Britain thing. But England did get around this problem, and some other countries in the world have, and then some other countries. Like, this is a big research thing that Works in Progress is interested in, because countries have solved this problem in amazing ways. So, for example, the Eastern Indian Punjab in 1947 was thought that the parliament was basically just representatives of the farmers. Everyone is a farmer. And they decided, let's once and for all, like, we've got this once in a lifetime chance to reorganize all of our land into nice even squares instead of having plots spread across a bunch of places. And they just did it in one big blast. And they also banned redividing it under a certain size. And now the Punjab has like beautifully squared land across all its territory, and it's visible from space that its cities expand in reasoned districts in one go, because the land, you can get a whole and plan a whole neighborhood. Whereas literally the rest of the entire subcontinent, except for the Punjab, it just has the development pattern we were talking about earlier, like southern Italy or Poland, where you have arterial streets built by the authorities, and everyone just adds like little cul-de-sacs on there, which build road but don't add any capacity. Instead, like the Punjab solved this, but very few places have.
Are you on the side of Stalin against the kulaks?
I don't think so. But I do think there's an interesting story there, which is that the exact same problem existed in Russia in the early 1900s. And Pyotr Stolypin, who was their last hope before the communist revolution, he was a conservative, but also a reformer, and thought our country is going to fall apart if we don't reform our economy, society, etc. Obviously, 70% of the economy is agriculture, so there's the first place to go. Funnily enough, the farm in Russia at the time is still run basically along the medieval collective farm model, like the medieval manor.
Like the cow-ocracy of Nottingham.
Everyone owns strips of land spread across all the big fields, which are good in a sense because it means that if you have a bad harvest in one field, you get insurance by having in all the other fields. But bad in another sense because if you farm only your own plots, you're moving your plough between all these places and spending loads of time. And so he tried to solve this problem and consolidate the farms into the things which became the kulaks later. Well, to at least some extent, very related. And funnily enough, he used a method where you had to get 2/3 of the farmers to agree, and millions of petitions went in to do this before they closed it off a few years later when the war started. But even in the time when they were doing it, it turned Russia into the world's top grain exporter because letting people consolidate their farms was so much more efficient. So I think I would have been on the side of the kulaks, but I think that Stalin had a point, which was that they hadn't finished reforming Soviet agriculture. He just had the exact wrong idea and sent it in the wrong direction, in my opinion.
Other reasons why 19th century successes aren't replicated. So for the monopoly model, you need to have... So the monopolists need to have quite a lot of... So one issue, so the monopolists all got price controlled in the 19th century in order to stop... They were allowed to use their monopoly powers to extract somewhat higher revenues. Like their prices could go up higher than they would be under competition. But they didn't allow them to just charge whatever prices they liked. And the usual rule was once they'd paid off the undertaking debt, the debt required to build the stuff in the first place, then the prices would have to come down after a while. They were allowed to make a profit, but they weren't allowed to make like endless super economic profit. And 19th century governments were mostly fairly good at not, like, they would price control, but they wouldn't price control so severely as to undermine the investment for future investors to build future infrastructure or undermine investment to maintain and upgrade existing infrastructure. There's two reasons for this. One is there was no inflation in the 19th century, so they didn't have the issue that societies have with inflation, which is that you constantly have to push up your price controls and you have a renewed battle with the public and renewed like rumpus about transport's just becoming more expensive, the cost of it. And the other was they did just have a like background political culture that was extremely sympathetic to private property rights. So for both Western and non-Western jurisdictions today, like neither of those obtains. All countries I assume have inflation most of the time, and like almost nowhere except maybe Japan has like 19th century respect for private property in the same way, and the belief that like no, it's okay for these guys do own this right. We're just definitely going to make them make a load of money from it. That's fine. So that's one of the reasons that monopolism. Two of the reasons that monopolism is hard to recreate. But the roads thing is still a bit of a puzzle to me. I still don't quite understand why it was that 19th century governments were so generous in their endowment of public space, and how governments later find it like so hard to get close to that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we can find some examples of developing country cities basically doing this kind of planning.
Oh yeah, definitely.
With negatives, like it's not always perfect, but I don't know how to pronounce it, but Gurgaon outside New Delhi and New Cairo, and they're in Marrakesh and Casablanca, there are examples in Morocco.
Yeah,
so you
Malaysia.
see examples around the world. They're not always nice in every respect, but they
Mhm.
often do plan out large public spaces. It does happen, but it seems to take a lot of directed effort rather than being the default thing that local governments do. I mean, one possibility is just that local government never got as strong of a hold in the non-European rooted places in the world because it doesn't have as deep of a tradition. And so we need to create more of it. Arjun Ramani at The Economist, or was it The Economist when he told me this, he always argued that India not having a deep tradition of local government was undermining its local government effectiveness in the modern day. And they needed to create more local government that wasn't appointed by the states and instead was an actual local government representing the local people and let them do things, including things that they might disagree with. I think that one thing we can say with your inflation point is that the kind of classic local government of the past that existed in lots and lots of different countries around the world basically died after the First World War to at least some extent. Like in Britain, you get price controls on lots of the things they sell. You get much more controversy about the way they're working, all after the big inflation that happens during the First World War that doesn't get wiped away afterwards. And you see kind of the similar thing in lots of different countries, right?
So the whole, like, all across the world, public transport moves into financial crisis in the 1910s, and lots of public transport systems go bankrupt or are on the verge of bankruptcy in the interwar period, just as cars start to come in. This also happens with utilities to some extent, but I think ultimately, like, utilities are so obviously vital that they do eventually raise prices, and utility systems generally remain viable around the world. But public transport doesn't have the same level of political protection, so it's totally stricken by that. Then you start getting, one of the things a forgotten episode is that nationalisation after the Second World War did not just affect privately owned assets, it also affected municipally owned assets. So in Britain, transport and utilities mostly end up getting nationalised, but like about half of them were already owned by local government. So they're being seized from the local government by the national government. And that's another kind of a strange episode of 20th century history, where an older, not necessarily like old tradition of municipal socialism is replaced by a tradition of like nationalized socialism.
What word do you think you brought there? So what you would say is
central government socialism.
Yeah. There's also the converse story, which is quite interesting, which is that lots of privatizations in various countries are privatizations of local stuff as well, right? So they take things that are being run locally and then force them out into the private sector. And instead of, it's not just national projects, it's also local projects. So, for example, in the UK, buses get deregulated,
right,
which means that anyone can run a bus.
Buses go back to being a like pre-monopolism system. It's a very curious thing, the history of English buses. They, like, most things are on this trajectory towards being funded through, like, controlled by the national government and funded through central taxation, or controlled nominally by local government, but tightly, what they do is controlled heavily by national government. But then there's this strange story of the bus system, which is plunged back into a hoteling problem, like undersupply early 19th century kind of model of infrastructure provision, and does indeed work badly, as except in London, where it remains under a kind of German style run by the city system and works much better.
Yeah, there are funny bus wars that you see in the Darlington bus war when everyone is racing to try and get the passengers, which is exactly what municipal socialists of the 1800s said. They all race to try and get the passengers. They all clog up the efficient routes, but then don't do any of the feeder routes, which makes them all less profitable. But then no one has any incentive to do the feeder routes.
So Britain has been reliving the experience of mid-19th century like British local government in the late 20th and early 21st century, having rerun privatization of the bus system, and now we're gradually municipalizing it again, right?
Yeah, so they've given them the power, and it's different cities are taking it over steadily over time. They generally seem to want to do it.
So there's one tendency towards privatizing local government services, one towards nationalizing them, one to running them down through price controls. You get tendencies to take away fiscal responsibility from local governments, so they're not able to raise money, they're not able to control their own taxes. What they can do is more tightly controlled by national governments. So in all sorts of different ways, these like very powerful and responsible local governments of the 19th century get kind of pulled apart and undermined in 20th century jurisdictions. And then it would be interesting to do a proper international study of this, but as Ben says, I think there's lots of jurisdictions around the world which just have never had a strong tradition of local government, and local government's not seen as having the same legitimacy, it doesn't have the same competence, it can't deliver the same. And so that, it may be, inflation's not going away, expropriatory attitudes towards private companies or whatever aren't going away, but it might be that we could get quite a lot closer to some of the successes of 19th century cities by looking carefully at local government and how to make it work again.
Last time the three of us gathered on the podcast, we talked about why newer buildings are ugly now. Is part of the reason all of these 19th century buildings were so beautiful is because of this kind of like socialist or monopolistic system?
Well, that was while I was writing about this, and I was talking about what regulations did they have on buildings. They had some height regulations justified, rightly or wrongly, through reference to externalities like fire and light for the street and these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
They had lots of fire regulations generally and building safety regulations.
You have an interesting example of New York not having those light regulations. And so New York ends up very, very tall. And then people, I think, they have to have windows, but those windows don't necessarily have to shine out anywhere. So you have those weird little grids where like people have windows. And you see this on like sitcoms that are set in New York, where like the background of people's houses will sometimes be they're looking out onto someone else's wall and fire escape.
This is a different phenomenon. This is New York allows originally 100% plot coverage, and they have whole city blocks get built over sort of like with a little veneer of daylighted rooms around the side.
Oh,
and then
so you have very, very valuable
that aren't
rooms
daylighted in the middle.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all fairly valuable because otherwise they would have put some courtyards in, but it's not valuable enough to. So the and then they start introducing rules that say, no, you need to have some kind of daylight to different rooms. But the rules are very lax. So the first version of the rules allows you to have windows between rooms as a way of satisfying this. So they don't change the plan at all. They just introduce windows between their rooms so that if you're in the middle of the building, you might just be able to look through a whole enfilade of windows and see a remote window to the outside at the edge of the city block. Then the rules get slightly tightened, and they say every inhabited room has to have its own window to the outside, but they don't specify what how much volume of the outside there needs to be. So they make these tiny light shafts and put masses of windows looking onto them so they can technically satisfy it.
I guess whole block coverage works for office buildings. Like you see it quite often with office buildings. And I guess that's just because people don't really need to divide the room up. So it's probably part of the reason we have lots of open plan offices.
Yeah, it's also because people seem to be much more tolerant, or at least their employers are tolerant of them not having daylight in their offices. People are very tolerant of having fluorescent lighting in offices.
You only go in the daytime as well, right? So it's not as bad.
You can also have very cold light in offices. So if you look in the Kelvin of light in most offices is like way beyond what anyone uses in a domestic context. And that's because in daytime that's fine. You don't mind having cold light in the daytime. That makes you work a bit more efficiently. And so whereas if you wouldn't want to live in the evening under Kelvins, you want to live under a warmer light. Anyway,
East Berlin has better streetlights than West Berlin, you would say, yeah?
Office blocks still today, you're exactly correct, office blocks today still often have a block usage that's very similar to those of 19th century New York blocks. They often fill in the middle and build over the whole thing with a gigantic floor plate. But in those days, they don't have electric, or they have very primitive kinds of electric lighting. They don't have modern ventilation, and these are often residential, not offices. So they are indeed quite dismal spaces that they create in the interior parts of these blocks. The authorities then very slowly regulate to remove that. That's not actually an externality-based kind of regulation. They're just regulating there because people find unpalatable the idea of other human beings living under. And if one were to be like a purist economist about it, you would point out like actually, when you cut out this space for the light wells, you're cutting out space that would otherwise have been people's homes. And the reason, why that space was previously being filled with home rather than with light well was because people value home more than they value light well. So in fact, it was probably value maximizing to build in the way that the industry was building before the regulations came in. Most of us, if you look at these buildings, it's quite hard to hold the line on economic principle there because they do look pretty ferocious. But
I was at a very wealthy person's house a couple of days ago, and they have a normal house sort of sitting on top of the plot, and then 5 or 6 stories of basement. And the 5 or 6 stories of basement is actually pretty sick.
Yeah, that's true, but we should remember the great gift of modern electric lighting and ventilation, which does make all these spaces. A space that was more than 30 foot from the facade wasn't considered to be rentable office space in New York. It could put poor housing in it, but not rentable office space in New York until the 1930s, I think, because that was when they invented fluorescent lights, and suddenly they became much lighter. But
I've just realised we're in a room with no real windows.
Yeah,
we've got a fake window,
but we do have. So the case of the New York light wells is actually an eccentricity for 19th century regulation, where it's not externality based. But in a way, it also goes to the point, which is that it was only this extreme case where very, very light touch, non-externality based regulations kicked in, where it's kind of paternalistic rules, where the government's saying, no, we just want you to have this nicer product, so we're going to impose a rule saying nearly all the regulations could be justified by the effect that one property owner had on another property owner when they did a certain thing. And if it was a harmful effect, the government might step in to block it. So while I was working on this, Ben says, it'd be extremely neat for your theory if it turned out that the aesthetics of 19th century cities were also the result of this kind of externality-based intervention. The government was like, when you have an ugly facade of a building, you destroy the value of all the neighbours, so we're going to step in and stop you from doing that. And that would cohere completely with the general theory that I'm giving about 19th century regulation. Unfortunately, for me, this is just not true at all, really. They had almost no public regulation for aesthetic character in the 19th century. The governments had aesthetic ideas, so when they compulsorily purchased land, like in Paris for the famous boulevards, or in parts of London in the same way, the state would then it would sell off the land to developers, and it would impose rules on what the developers could do, and it would say, no, we want this street to have a uniform facades, and it needs to use this kind of stone, and it needs to use these details. They could become quite, pernickety about it. But that was only acting in their capacity as a landowner, not in their capacity as a regulator. Their capacity as a regulator, it's like structural integrity, fire safety, and then occasionally in these extreme cases, compassion-based interventions to stop gruesome kinds of
poor children growing up never seeing daylight.
But not regulation on beautiful facades. And you could have made a building that was pretty much as ugly as you liked in the 19th century, and the state would have been silent on the matter. So we are returned back to the things that we've discussed in previous podcasts, the beautiful facades of 19th century building and all the money that they put into it. That was a result of demand from buyers for this, despite the fact that they were much poorer than we are, and they were just prepared to add a little bit to their build costs in order to enhance the public aspect of the building and to benefit all of their neighbors in this way. So that's leads on into a whole interesting topic, but also sits somewhat outside the main thing that I've been researching on 19th century cities, which is how successful their regulation was.
So I think the conclusion we've come to is that the cities of the 19th century were built so fast and so well in terms of lots of public space and everyone getting more space per capita and excellent infrastructure, in part because of their features that we don't have today. People could build pretty much whatever they wanted. Infrastructure was provided more than was needed, and people paid for most of their public services at a rate that covered their costs. So more public services did not cost the public purse anymore. I think we also have come to the view that bringing some of these back is probably desirable. In terms of building freedom, that's pretty much what we work on a lot of our time. We have lots of friends who work on the building freedom element, and I wish them best of luck because I think it's very important. And in terms of building better infrastructure. That's another important thing. But I think the less discussed thing is giving local governments some of the powers that they had in the past, some of the responsibilities, some of the powers, treating them more like companies and less like just
agencies of the national government.
Agencies of the national government, exactly. And in some countries today, to be clear, that is already the case. And I might make the case that that's one of the reasons why most of those countries are more successful than Britain at building homes. And one surprising thing is that the beauty of 19th century cities is still, as far as we can tell, a mystery. People wanted it and were willing to pay for it, and we don't know exactly why. Thank you for listening to the Works in Progress podcast. I'm Ben Southwood, one of the editors of Works in Progress, and I was here with Aria Schrecker, another editor, and Samuel Hughes, yet another editor. Thank you.